In this lecture, we will move to the opposite side of the world from the Mediterranean. While in the West, the new Roman Empire was expanding, in the East, another great empire, the Chinese Han, was also spreading. Just like in the West, the Han Empire came into conflict with tribal people as it expanded, imposed new rules about family life, and stimulated rebellions. Here in the East, we will follow the fortunes of two sisters in Vietnam who rebelled against the powerful Han Empire. It's difficult to write about Trung Trac and her sister Trung Nhi because the sources of information are few, and the contemporary texts were written by the Chinese. But I think the effort is worth it because even today, the Trung sisters have become symbols of Vietnamese identity and their struggle for freedom. When I traveled in Vietnam and saw their statues and festivals, I wondered who they were and what they did. Here I can tell you what they did. Who they were as women remains elusive. But what matters most is how they became symbols of freedom for the people of Vietnam. I'll begin their story in the year 25, in the Red River Delta in Vietnam, where Trac and Nhi grew up. This region had been conquered by the Han Dynasty of China more than 100 years earlier, but life in the Delta was about to change, pulling the region into rebellion. First, let's look at life in the Delta to get an idea of traditional Vietnam culture that was about to change. The tribes of this Delta had lived here for centuries, and they prospered because of the richness of the river. The Red River rises in China and rushes along for some 750 miles down through mountain gorges before it spreads into the Delta. This triangular region of some 5,000 square miles contains rich lowlands as the river system empties into the Gulf of Tonkin near Hanoi. The region is full of mangrove swamps, many species of water birds, and vicious saltwater crocodiles. Villagers built houses on stilts to keep out the water and the animals. And the design was so effective that we can still see these houses dotting the landscape in the foothills and river valleys. This region had been ruled by legendary kings in the Han Dynasty, who had ruled from about 2800 BCE. These rulers tattooed crocodiles on their thighs to capture the courage of the fierce beasts and to serve as tokens to keep the animals away. Recognizing these tattoos, the Chinese for centuries referred to Vietnam as the land of the crocodile men. The kings lived at the borders of the lowland delta and the neighboring hills, so they could control both regions. Trung Trac and Trung Nhi were related to the legendary Han kings on their maternal side. This noble relationship gave them some license to rule, and as we will see, they would take advantage of it. The villagers in the Delta prospered because of the rich rice fields that they irrigated from the rising waters of the Red River. The Chinese had perfected the domestication and cultivation of rice in wet paddies some 10,000 years earlier, and the spread of rice down to the Red River Delta had been lost in the mists of time. Here in Vietnam, the cultivation had been firmly established, and the Delta produced 2 abundant crops a year. People cultivated the rice, helped by their water buffaloes. The people were called the Lac by the Chinese, and the name refers to the Vietnamese way of irrigating their rice fields. The villages also grew rich on trade that extended north to China and south to the Mekong Delta and beyond. Besides their abundant rice, the Vietnamese traded their natural resources like copper, iron, gold, silver, and jade. They even grew rich exporting cowrie shells, much prized by the Chinese as symbols of fertility and luck. The Lac tribes had learned to cast bronze in about 1000 BCE and still used bronze tools and weapons in the year 25. Today, archaeologists call this Bronze Age in Vietnam the Dong Son culture. Their most striking artifact was a bronze drum that they cast and decorated beautifully. Some of the drums were of an extraordinary size. They could weigh up to 159 pounds and required huge amounts of smelted copper. But the drums sounded the heartbeat of the villages and clans that spread throughout the Delta and the neighboring highlands. They were played for feasts and funerals, and they called the clan's warriors together for war. As we will see, soon the two noble Trung sisters would sound the drums for war. To begin to understand the origins of the war, we first must understand something about the social life of the Vietnamese and the status of their women. Traditional Viet society was based on clans, not on nuclear families. And within these clans, women carried a great deal of sovereignty. In fact, some anthropologists consider the Dong Son culture to be matriarchal, with a child's mother being much more important than ties of paternity. Young women were free to choose lovers at spring festivals, and if a girl became pregnant during these events, the young man was to go to her clan, marry her, and be accepted as a son-in-law. If she did not get pregnant, she was free to choose another young man. Mothers were responsible for raising the children, and proverbs echo this ancient time as they say, "A spoiled child is attributable to the mother or grandmother," or, "If a child does wrong, it's the mother who bears responsibility." This responsibility extended into adulthood, and women and grandmothers were regularly consulted about the plans and fortunes of their clan. Trac and Yi's mother was a widow who raised her two daughters on her own, and this was solidly within the matriarchal tradition. She taught the girls skills usual for both women and men. The girls learned to raise silkworms, and they also learned to make roasted silkworm pupai, which is a popular dish in North Vietnam today. But the girls were also brought up to lead outside the home. Their mother also had her daughters trained in the martial arts, sword fighting and archery, and they learned to ride the war elephants that accompanied the armies through the jungles. According to legend, Trung Trac, the elder daughter, was very heroic, courageous, and good at bold stratagem. In 111 BC, expanding Han Dynasty of the Chinese extended southward and conquered most of North Vietnam. The Chinese ruled the rich Red River Delta province, as well as the two regions north and south of the Delta, so they controlled the whole Gulf of Tonkin. For over a century, the Chinese rule rested lightly on the land of the Loch. The clan system remained in place, and women continued to wield a good deal of authority. The drums still sounded through the hills, and clans gathered together to celebrate and sometimes fight among each other. The Chinese influence was felt most strongly in the prosperity that grew as trade from the Han Empire extended all the way to the west, connecting to the Roman Empire across the famous Silk Road. The Chinese presence showed in garrisons placed in the provinces, but they were only a token force. However, in 25 CE, events far to the north in the Han Empire created changes that would affect the provinces far to the south in Vietnam. What was going on in the north? A brief revolution that overthrew the Han Emperor for about 16 years caused a backlash that rippled down into the Delta, changing the status quo. The Han Empire that had been established in 206 BCE experienced a brief lapse in rule when a rebellion introduced a new dynasty, the Jin. This dynasty lasted only from 9 CE to 23 CE and was ruled only by one emperor. The newly restored Han Dynasty is called the Eastern Han because its emperors moved the capital from Shangang east to Luoyang. The Eastern Han Empire continued for another 200 years until 220 CE. The new victorious Han Emperor took the name Guangwudi when he took the throne, and he ruled until 57 CE, a good long reign. which gave him plenty of time to implement changes that he was sure would ensure the success of the Han Dynasty and avoid future rebellions. Under Guangwudi, the light rule of the Han in Vietnam changed. There were two related reforms that Guangwudi introduced that changed things throughout the empire, as well as in Vietnam. First, like many emperors before and since, Guangwudi needed money to replace the losses he incurred during the war and to finance his new city. So he raised taxes all over the empire. To implement these new taxes in Vietnam, he sent a new governor to the south. He chose a man named Jen Yen to serve as prefect to Vietnam. We have a biography written to praise Jen Yen, so it emphasizes his accomplishments. But even if we make allowances for his desire to praise his deeds, we can see that he made some radical changes to life in Vietnam. His first claim was that he brought iron, and with the introduction of iron farming tools, he increased production. We know that the Iron Age began in Vietnam about this time, so this is probably accurate. Jen Yen's second major reform was as revolutionary. The Han Dynasty emperors had begun to embrace Confucianism as part of their official policies. In a nutshell, Confucius believed that a good society was a hierarchic society, with all content in their status and obedient to those above them. Everyone, of course, was obedient to the emperor. In this system, women were also placed in the hierarchy, and they were always to be subservient to fathers and husbands, and in their old age, their sons. This philosophy was incompatible with traditional Vietnamese views on women's personal sovereignty and sexual freedom. Jen Yen wanted a society based on clear family households, with women subservient to men and men subservient to rulers. A cultural clash was inevitable. The new Chinese governor began to enforce this view of the correct order of society by focusing first on marriage. He passed a law ordering all men between the ages of 20 and 50 to pick a partner and marry. All women between the ages of 15 and 40 were also to marry. He reputedly conducted a marriage ceremony for 1,000 couples. As Chinese concepts of marriage were enforced through the locked society, traditional structures began to weaken. I want to stop this narrative for a moment to consider how similar Jen Yen's marriage laws are to Caesar Augustus's laws at the beginning of the Roman Empire. In my lecture on Julia, I showed how sexual legislation caused even the emperor's daughter to rebel. And here, at the other side of the world, the same thing was happening. It seems that these emperors found the control of marriage to be central to governing a well-ordered state. And as they imposed these rules, women's roles became restricted. Caesar Augustus was no Confucian, so the Chinese motivation isn't likely to be simply philosophical. No, Jen Yen offered a second motivation that was more practical and perhaps more similar to Roman motivations. It was easier to collect taxes from identifiable households, and nuclear families made easy taxable targets. So Confucianism was a convenient philosophy to impose. Marriage was regulated, and women's freedom was restricted. In any case, marriage laws were implemented in Vietnam, taxes were raised, and people began to grow angry. About a decade after these laws were imposed by the Han Dynasty, a new governor was appointed to the Delta region. This man was Ting, and according to even the Chinese sources, he was the worst kind of administrator. He was corrupt and laid ever heavier taxes on the people. His administration was so bad that the Chinese sources wrote, "The 100 clans clamor injustice and stop government officials on the roads to complain." The bronze drums began to sound in the hills, beating of their discontent with this ruler. And among the discontented were a local ruler named Trac and his wife, Trac. Trac vociferously complained about the treatment of the people, and he was killed for his outspoken objections. Some sources say he was not killed, but just let his wife take the lead. Perhaps the rumor of his death was a way to play down Trac's leadership, but we'll never know. In either case, Trac decided it was time to throw off the Chinese yoke. She enlisted her sister, Trung, and they called together the local clan leaders and stirred them to fight. Among the people Trac recruited were several women who had been entering into small skirmishes with the Chinese. Even the Trung sister's mother joined the movement, leading troops on her own. The combined forces included a number of men and women generals fighting together, leading their own troops. They began their rebellion in the spring of 39 or 40 as people gathered together to celebrate spring festivals. The drums called fighters not only from the Delta, but from the neighboring provinces, and their growing army included both men and women. According to legend, which in this case is plausible, the sisters mounted war elephants and led the armies. At first, they had great success. Elephants and horses served to move troops through the forest trails, and bronze-tipped arrows and spears struck with lethal force. These tribal armies subdued local Chinese garrisons, and the Chinese sources write with disdain. The governor and the Chinese prefects could barely manage to save their own skins. The women's armies managed to take 65 cities, unifying the whole territory under their rule. The end of the spring campaign saw these stunning victories. The people gathered together and proclaimed Trac, the elder sister, queen. She began her benign rule in the year 40, establishing her capital near modern Hanoi in the rich Delta. Her first act as queen was to abolish the taxes that had been imposed by the Chinese. Beyond that, legend says that she ruled lightly, favoring trade both from the sea and through the woodland trails into the highlands. Both these practices suggest she wanted to restore the customs of the native Vietnamese, as well as to foster the prosperity that had always come with trade into the Delta. It should come as no surprise that Emperor Guangwudi would not leave the Trung sisters in charge of these prosperous provinces in what he considered South China. In part, the problem was their gender. A neo-Confucius saying claimed, "A woman ruling is like a hen crowing." They were unnatural and unsuited to a well-ordered kingdom. No, the empire was going to strike back. It just took some time. It's about 860 miles from the Han capital of Luoyang to Mei Lin, which is near Hanoi. An ancient army would take about 3 months to travel this distance, if conditions were good. And conditions were not good when traveling to Vietnam. The first problem was the monsoon season that brought daily deluges between May and October. There would be no traveling through the deep, mud-swept paths during that season. In addition, the Red River Delta surrounding Hanoi was itself surrounded by a rough mountainous buffer zone that was wild and inaccessible. Independent tribes dotted the valleys, and it's still a region of many ethnic minorities today that echo the ancient tribes who settled in the hills. Finally, there is the problem of fighting in the rainforests. Even modern warfare in these conditions is difficult. The Emperor Guangwudi took his time preparing for war. According to the Chinese accounts, he ordered troops to be raised in his southern provinces. Then he repaired the roads and bridges into Vietnam and ordered his men to cut paths through the mountains and the high mountain passes. He then commanded his people to prepare carts to carry equipment and boats to ferry supplies along the coast. Finally, the emperor stockpiled rice to supply what might be a long war. The Chinese could not use their fierce war chariots along the forest trails. This would be a slow march with horses and foot soldiers through mountains and forests. But the emperor was patient and relentless. With preparations made, in the summer of 42, The emperor appointed a general to lead this expedition. He chose Ma Yuan, a famous but elderly general who had recently put down other rebellions against the Han. The 58-year-old general was given the designation, the general who subdues the waves, a nice euphemism for his charge of ruthlessly subduing the Lac Viet rebellion. Ma Yuan had some 20,000 troops at his disposal. There were not enough boats to transport the troops by sea, so he began a long trek overland. It took a year, until 43, before Ma Yuan reached the Delta. Historians dispute where exactly the general camped. Was it Ho Tai, the West Lake in Hanoi? Perhaps, but most suggest he arrived in Tien Du, a wooded area in the Delta. The chroniclers don't record any military encounters between Ma Yuan and the Trung forces during his long march to the Delta. It may be that her scouts couldn't report his movements, so the women did not know exactly where he was. It may also be that Trung Trac waited until he arrived to choose the time of her confrontation. Perhaps she trusted the difficult Vietnamese terrain to take its toll. If so, she was right. In his later memoirs, Ma Yuan recalled the difficulties his forces faced. His fleet admiral had died of illness along the way, and things got worse in the camp. As the general wrote, "We had yet to defeat the enemy, yet the situation was such that there was flooding everywhere with thick clouds overhead and effluences emanating in abundance. One could look up and see even vultures fall down to their death as they flew by." Okay, I doubt that vultures were dropping from the air, but rain and malarial fever would certainly have taken their toll. Finally, the Trung sisters decided to engage. One source said only the younger sister, Trung Nhi, marched down with their army to confront Ma Yuan. The Chinese were weakened and outnumbered, but the skill of the general more than made up for these weaknesses. The discipline of the Chinese soldiers confronted chaotic charges of tribal forces, and the Vietnamese were soundly defeated. Several thousand of the Trung's troops were killed, and over 10,000 either surrendered or were captured. The sisters fled the field. The Trungs fled to the Cam Ke district to the west and gathered some of their remaining forces to them. There are several different versions about what happened next. But beyond the differing details of location and engagements, the general outlines of the story are clear. It took Ma Yuan some years to follow the rebellious forces. During that time, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi engaged the Chinese forces repeatedly. They lost every encounter and had to retreat into the hills and the forests. In the end, Ma Yuan managed to kill both sisters. He chopped off their heads and had them sent back to Luoyang to the emperor to prove his victory. The Vietnamese legends offer a slightly different ending to the story. They write, "When they reached the dead end in Cam Ke, the two sisters in despair had to drown themselves in the hot river." This is a more heroic end. The sisters weren't killed. They chose to sacrifice themselves for the cause of Vietnamese independence. This becomes the prevailing legend, but I am inclined to believe the Chinese story. Ma Yuan had pursued them too long to let them die in peace. The death of the Trung sisters did not end the rebellion. Ma Yuan took 2,000 boats and 20,000 more soldiers to pursue the remnants of Trung Trac's army. He killed, decapitated, and arrested over 5,000 soldiers. It took him a couple of more years for this mop-up operation. He had to cut tunnels through mountains to move his troops and had to take land routes to avoid choppy seas along the coast. But in the end, he prevailed. Ma Yuan's goal was not only to win a military victory. He wanted to convert the region to a fully Chinese province. To achieve this goal, he confiscated the great bronze drums that had echoed through the region. This act both attacked the identity of the clans of the region and cut off their means of summoning each other to battle. He had these drums smelted down to make a solid bronze horse to present to the emperor as a victory token. Once Ma Yuan had pacified the region, the Chinese garrisons were once more installed. Taxes continued to be collected and sent north to China. The noble children of Vietnam began to go to Chinese schools, where they studied Confucian texts. Slowly, old ideas of matriarchy and tribal society began to give way to hierarchy and patriarchy. This was Ma Yuan's real victory. This could have been the end of the story of the rebellion of the Trung sisters, who ruled for only a couple of years. But history sometimes takes peculiar turns. Often what matters most is how people are remembered. And in time, the Trung sisters became among the most important women in Vietnamese history. They became symbols of freedom. As one modern historian has written, the Trungs crystallized the idea of freedom and independence in the mind of the Lok people and their descendants, as well as the idea that they belonged to a different cultural group than the Chinese. Sometime after their deaths, people erected altars to the Trungs' sacrifice. The most famous is in Hanoi today. This temple was founded in 1087 and rebuilt in 1142 at the site where it stands today. The sanctuary contains statues of the two sisters kneeling with arms raised as if to inspire a crowd. Once a year, the statues are carried to the Red River, taken out in a boat and carefully washed before they are brought back to the temple. Over time, people gave offerings at these altars, and sometimes small miracles seem to have appeared. Rain saves a crop, a child is healed. At a national level, whenever the Vietnamese struggled to overthrow invaders, the Trung sisters were invoked as symbols and models to follow. In 248, another woman invoked the Trung sisters as she led a revolt against the Chinese. Lady Trieu, as she was popularly known, fought for years before she drowned herself in a river to avoid being defeated. The uprising ended, but again, people remembered the struggle led by a woman. Finally, the Chinese rule ended in 939, and the newly installed Vietnamese rulers offered sacrifices at the shrines of the Trung sisters. But their story doesn't end even here. The history of Vietnam is filled with ongoing wars against invaders, from future Chinese invasions to the French colonial period to the devastating American War. The Trung sisters were invoked as the patience of the Vietnamese people to struggle for independence. The sisters did not just remain symbolic, however. They inspired real people, real women, to participate in the wars in the peninsula. In the American War, women fought with North Vietnamese Viet Cong forces at all levels. Today, now that peace has finally come to Vietnam, people still celebrate the sacrifice of the Trung sisters. There are statues of the sisters in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh City, former Saigon. In fact, I became curious about these women warriors when I traveled in Vietnam and saw their statues that are so respected. Countries choose their symbols, hold on to them tenaciously, and such symbols create a national identity. That's the influence of Trung Trac and Trung Nhi. The celebration of their lives continues today. There is an annual holiday in February to commemorate the deaths of the Trung sisters, and two lucky women are chosen to embody the sisters and ride great decorated elephants in a parade. Trung Trac and Trung Nhi have assumed a position in Vietnamese culture that is, for me, astonishingly disproportionate to their brief lives. They became symbols of a Vietnamese identity that remained even as the people spoke Chinese and adopted Confucian ideology. One modern Vietnamese historian wrote that after each political victory, people turned to the Trungs to say, "You led the way, queens. We just followed you." There's no more powerful tribute than that.